Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. Today we're using the readings designated for the day of Epiphany, which is technically January 6th, 12 days after Christmas. This has been recognized as the day of the Magi's arrival in Bethlehem, and that's where the idea of 12 days of Christmas comes from. It also coincides loosely with what would have been the original date of Christmas if we were still following the Julian calendar, as the early church did. Starting in the 1500s, the church, along with the rest of Western society, began to adopt the Gregorian calendar. December 25 was always the date assigned to Christmas from the 300s and on, but when converted from the Gregorian to the Julian calendar, it now falls on January 7. Many Eastern Orthodox Christian churches still technically follow the Julian calendar, but in the last century, most agreed to accept December 25 as the day of Christmas. But January 7, or roughly the day of Epiphany, is the historic day that Orthodox Christians celebrated Christmas. So today we're talking about the Magi. I hope you're all appropriately drawn in by the mysteries of history and the confusion thereof. Christmas Eve, is kind of a time to delight in the Christmas story. And with a bit of distance from that now, I want to use today's message to reflect in a bit more academic way about this part of the Christmas story. According to what we heard today, the Magi followed the star because for them it was an astrological sign of a new king. And very often the Magi have been regarded as wise men or three kings. And Matthew only mentions that they brought three gifts, as I told the kids, but makes no mention of how many came. Most Western churches have often referenced three kings or three wise men as tradition. But some Orthodox churches have a tradition that numbers them at 12, interestingly. The term in Greek used to identify these visitors is literally magi, and that word is related to our word magic. These people were from the east, and we can't know for sure who they were, but we have some pretty good guesses. One of the most obvious regions to the east at that time was the Parthian Empire, which encompassed modern-day Iran and Iraq. And in the Parthian Empire, there were Zoroastrian priests. They were adept at astronomy, astrology, interpretation of dreams, fortune-telling, and magic. And this is why they're so aware of the star in the sky. There are modern astronomers who think the Star of Bethlehem that they led them to Bethlehem may have been the appearance of Jupiter in conjunction with the sun, the moon, and Saturn in the constellation of Aries, which modern calculations show occurred on April 17th in the year 6 BC. And that does fall within the range that scholars believe was the actual date of Jesus' birth. The visit of the Magi also can be seen as a fulfillment of what Isaiah 60 says, "Arise, shine, for your light has come." Isaiah is talking about a coming Messiah and refers to the arrival of kings from Midian, Ephah, and Sheba, which would be modern-day Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. Some of the gifts mentioned are associated with these areas, and it's possible that the Magi were representatives of kings from these regions. But what's so interesting is that you have people who are very much outside of the religious and cultural traditions of Israel coming to find this new king, Jesus. And if you visit the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, you'll find an ancient mosaic on the grounds depicting the Magi who have darker skin. In 614 AD, during the period of the Crusades, when there were atrocities committed on both sides, Persians entered Bethlehem, and the tradition is that they saw the mosaic and spared the Church of the Nativity from destruction because they saw these figures depicted in the mosaic as themselves. The church was preserved again about 400 years later for similar reasons. So hopefully, this gives you a little more to think about when it comes to the three kings. There's another important figure in this story, and that is King Herod. And as I've mentioned on many occasions, Herod was one of the more ruthless leaders in ancient history. When the Magi come asking about the new king, they assume, of course, he must be the son of the current king. Not a great idea on their part. And Herod tries to hide his paranoia from the Magi. He's obviously threatened. Herod was known for countless atrocities, including the murder of his own wife for political and personal reasons, as well as two of his sons who had sought revenge against him for their mother's death. Herod himself was feared and disliked by his servants, and you may have heard me tell this story before, one that I learned when I visited Israel in seminary. We stood in the remains of his summer palace in Jericho, and it was there that Herod was in his hot tub, and it appeared to his servants that he had slipped under the water and drowned, and his servants began jumping up and down, rejoicing, and that's when he came up out of the water to see them all happy at his apparent death. And you can imagine what happened next. Again, at the end of his life, Herod was seriously ill, but because he was able to see his end coming, he ordered that upon his death, another son, as well as men who had been locked up by him, should be executed to ensure that there would actually be mourning at his death throughout the land. Herod had been crowned by Rome as king of Judea, the southern portion of Israel, because of his unwavering loyalty to Rome, but he had to fight to actually get that power, and he never turned that kind of brutal and paranoid instinct off. In the verses that follow, we later find out that Herod orders the death of every child under 2 years old in Bethlehem, and it seems almost too terrible to be true, but when you get to know Herod better, it certainly would be in character for him. So this is the king the Magi visit to inquire about the newborn King Jesus. And so who is this newborn king? The visit by the Zoroastrian priests, we assume from the east, honors Jesus and offers a sign of the kind of king that he'll become. But it also makes clear that the mission and appeal of Jesus will transcend this tiny region of Judea. Today, no one believes that Jesus came to be a worldly king to govern Israel, but that wasn't so obvious to some at the time. Jesus had every opportunity to go all in being king of his people in every sense of that term, but he chose a different path. That spiritual path has plenty of worldly implications that each of us needs to confront and apply to the decisions we make along with our society. But his message and purpose was always bigger than that. It's not so much about directly governing a society, but about how we govern our own lives. If we call Jesus a king, it's about his reign in heaven, and it's about the devotion he earns because of his humility, his love for all people, including foreigners and those seen as outside God's favor, and his desire to establish peace that begins inside of each of us. The Magi's gift of myrrh in particular was used to anoint bodies at death, and that foreshadows something about his life and death, especially as Matthew describes the threat that he poses, even as a baby, to the powers in that world. Already we can see that there will be a crisis point at some future time, and in the verses that follow the story today, Jesus escapes the killing of children in Bethlehem with his family but his presence will continue to be seen as a threat. And so the Magi and Herod show us two responses to Jesus: devotion and fear. The first one causes us to look beyond ourselves to God and to think of ourselves and our lives in perspective with a sense of humility, gratitude, and joy. This is an act of worship. The wise men exhibited that. The second one would cause us to be filled with fear like Herod. Herod was afraid of losing something, power. Fear turns us inward and can ultimately cause pain and hardship for ourselves and others beyond what is necessary. Worship and devotion require well-placed faith. They require us to believe that as we turn our attention to God, that we have nothing to fear. God loves us and desires good for us and the world. This is something that becomes clear in the life and teachings of Jesus. The wise men devote time and effort to seeking out this newborn king, but Herod, Matthew says, was frightened when he heard about this new king, and all Jerusalem with him, because they knew exactly what he was capable of doing. He's devoted only to himself, and it leads to a destructive path. But the wise men, the Magi, when they saw that the star had stopped, were overwhelmed with joy. They knelt down in the makeshift home of Mary and Joseph and Jesus, and they opened their treasure chests. And today, there are still two responses when we encounter Jesus: devotion that is earned through his humility, grace, and love, or fear that is born out of what we perceive we may lose. Jesus represents a different way of using authority with humility, restraint, and love, instead of power, aggression, deceit, and brutality. Jesus came into a troubled and flawed world and offered a different way forward. In many ways, it's a path that we still struggle to embrace. We're called continually to see ourselves in the light of this vision of Jesus as a different kind of king and to be transformed. If we can receive the grace that Jesus offers us and live into a new future, maybe that's the beautiful kingdom that ancient prophets like Isaiah envisioned, and the hope that even the Magi were drawn to seek out. When there are other competing visions, it's more important than ever to return again and again to the vision that Jesus lived and died for. Through his life and death, he revealed God's love for you and me and all peoples. If that's the kind of king the Magi went to worship, then he's still worthy of our devotion today. Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.